Good evening. My name is Dennis Altman, and I'm moderating this evening. One of our panellists, Jessica, is on her way. In fact, she is making a grand entrance. Oh, of course. You know, the rest of us have had to sit and shiver with instant coffee in the green room. Okay, can I do three things at the very beginning as Jessica comes on stage? Can I first of all... You are determined to upstage me, aren't you? Can I first of all acknowledge that we're on the land of the Wurundjeri people? Can I also acknowledge that the International AIDS Conference is, of course, in many ways overshadowed by our awareness of having lost people in the plane that was shot down over Ukraine? And can I also acknowledge the presence at the back of the room of Hares and Hyenas, which is a remarkable queer... Thank you. A really remarkable queer institution in Melbourne. And we will all be around at the end helping roll and flog our wares in various means. This evening is a discussion of the sort that doesn't usually take place in the main stages of the International AIDS Conference, but should. And I want to make a couple of very short comments about the evening and how this panel came into being, and then I'm going to open a discussion by throwing a couple of questions at each of our panellists. It's clearly not rehearsed. Jessica and I have just met.
I meant to do that.
We've just met. Okay. Can I first of all note that we are, of course, in no ways representative of those parts of the world where HIV is most widespread. That putting together a panel on the cultural impact of AIDS at this conference was extremely difficult to avoid, essentially doing a panel that is first world and queer. And that is not the face of the global epidemic, and we are all very conscious of that. And that is an important point for us to bear in mind. And had we had unlimited resources, had we been able to bring in some of the people I would love to have been sitting on stage with, we would have been able to respond to that. But it is clearly a conversation for people in Melbourne about a world that many of us live in. One of the problems is that when you talk about culture in the AIDS world, people don't really know what you mean. Culture is something you do after dinner as entertainment. It's not seen as a serious part of the discussion. I think all of us on this stage would want to take exception to that. And so I just made a list of some of the things that will probably come into all our heads when we think about the cultural impact of the epidemic. And oddly, I went back, and this is, I think, a sign of age and memory, to that early fundraising album, Red Hot and Blue, which some of you will remember. I went back to the first panels of the AIDS quilt in Australia, and my memory of the quilt being laid out in Parliament House in Canberra in 1990, with many of the people who'd lost friends, family and lovers. I thought back to the films that, whatever we think of them, have had more impact on how most people out there understand the epidemic than all the work the AIDS industry is doing down at the convention centre. And I thought particularly what I think is the single most interesting cultural manifestation of at least the Western First World epidemic, namely Angels in America, which of course was restaged in Australia last year and created sufficient interest, which Jessica and Sean won't necessarily know, that when it was restaged in Sydney, they moved it from the Belvoir to one of the main theatres in the city because people were clearly gripped by the imaginative rendering of the epidemic. And that's sort of the background. Now, I'm going to begin by asking each of our panellists to introduce themselves by telling us three things about themselves they'd like everybody in this room to know as background to the discussion. And I think I'll just go from Dion, from you, across back to me, and then I'm going to throw some questions at each of you.
Okay, well, I'm Dion Kagan. I'm a lecturer in gender studies at Melbourne University, and the dramatic rendering of the epidemic that Dennis just referred to is exactly my field of research. So I'm writing a book now, which came out of my PhD research on popular culture representations of AIDS. And obviously AIDS is a kind of monolithic topic, so the limitations on that were images of AIDS and gay men. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and I look at the popular. That's probably two things about me, I guess. A third is that the thing that drew me to this field of research initially was I'm one of those people that was born in the very early 80s and is the kind of same age as HIV, and was aware of it long before I was even kind of sexually aware or had sexually come of age. And weirdly, it was absent from the whole kind of middle part of my life, and now it's been a strong part of my professional life. And what I guess drew me to it as a research topic was how absent it had become in popular culture, although I think that might be shifting. And that's
all you've got time for, Dion. I've promised them already that I am a fascist chair, and I'm a fascist chair in the interest of everybody having a chance to say something. Paul?
Okay, well, I'm a bit nervous now.
Good.
I probably just outed myself as British by the accent. My name's Paul Woodward. I am HIV positive. That's my first thing, and that's important to my work as a storyteller, performance kind of guy. I'm an academic. I lectured for 16 years at a university in England. I work internationally, so I work obviously here in Melbourne, but I work in London, and I've been fortunate enough to work in Swaziland, Malawi, and in townships just outside of Cape Town. And I'm doing a PhD at Monash called The Performativity of Disclosure. And I'm kind of trying to apply performance theory to unpack what happens in the moment of HIV disclosure. So just an idea of if you've thought about what you're going to say before you're about to disclose, to what extent is that a script? If you're deciding to do it in a bedroom or a restaurant, to what extent is that an environment, or a set? And how are you going to bring in sort of an understanding of actor-audience relationship to the text of a disclosure? So I'm using performance theory to, in the first instance, to understand what happens in that moment, and then secondly, to create workshops that can empower positive people to disclose with greater ease and confidence and fluidity. And then the master plan is to then sort of see if I can jumble that up back together again and make that performance practice for the stage, to get positive people to speak about their own lives and not in a verbatim sense. Thank you.
This is introductions. This is not lectures. Jessica?
Okay, hi. I'm so sorry I was late. Anyway, I can't help but also think that you're like, tell us 3 things that we don't know about you. So in my head, I'm like, don't say touch my tongue to my nose, because I can do that. And then I'm also a woman living with HIV. I think similar to you, it's been part of my identity and definitely is the driving force behind all of the work that I do. I use my own body and experience as the primary site of all of my work. Which the majority has been working with women living with HIV, with an emphasis on sexual rights, identifying as a queer woman living with HIV. It's a very lonely place, and I'm very, I have to remind most of my friends I'm not actually a gay man. And
but
so,
you do it so well.
I know. I also go to the bathhouse, but it's not the same. It's a different one. But yeah, so the majority of my work has been as a community organizer. I merge art and activism to create social change and building communities primarily of women living with HIV.
Great. Sean.
Great. I'm Sean Strub, and I'm a person living with HIV. I've had HIV my entire adult life. I was looking at medical records, infected when I was 20 or 21. And a lot of my perspective on the epidemic is shaped by having been involved in it and having gotten very sick 18 years ago. I weighed 42 or 3 pounds less than I weigh right now. And I had a viral load of 3.3 million and a CD4 count of 1, for those of you who know what that means. It was covered in Kaposi sarcoma lesions, the purple spots over my body and in my lungs. My work today is focused mostly around combating HIV-related stigma, which I will tell you I believe is much worse today than it has ever been, which is something that people who don't have HIV find very surprising and startling, and maybe we'll get to talk about some of that. And specifically a phenomenon known as HIV criminalization, which is a very important topic at the conference this week. And lastly, when I was a child, for a while, I wanted to grow up and become a tree.
I should explain. The reason I wanted to hurry you through the introductions is I'm going to throw questions at each of you, and in fact, I really wanted you to feed your personal experiences into these questions. But also remember, you all have experience in, as I say, what in the world of AIDS is often thought of as the cultural after dinner bits. And the question that I really want to pose to you and think about is, had AIDS not happened, had there not been this epidemic, and let's think back to the beginnings in the 1980s, how different would your lives and the world be? I know this is a tough question. I'm going to throw it first at you, Sean, because I think you've probably thought about this in various ways.
I think first and foremost, I think the world would be a gentler place. The epidemic has wiped out millions of some of the most gentle and giving and loving people on earth, and we are paying an enormous price for their absence. And personally, I'm not sure. I think I would still be involved in political and social change organizing and activism.
Jessica?
Well, I've never really thought about that question, but I've also often thought about what if I was given a pill, a cure to make it go away. Because my life is, I feel like a lot of my work, almost everything I do and touch and feel and see, my whole life has been immersed in HIV and the subcultures that are created around it. And I don't know who I would be or who I would become. So it's often like I don't know. It's challenging when your self is defined by your illness, is defined by all social stigma. There's so much that rides on it, and I think that. I don't know if it would actually be long and deep thoughts about making that part of me go away, because I think I would be very lost without it.
Paul?
Yeah, okay, 3 things come to mind quickly. I think being positive has just made me more honest, really, and that's had a knock-on effect in my work. My work was all very physical theatre and avant-garde, and now it's just become very simple storytelling, it makes me honest. The second thing is just to Africa. I've met some extraordinary souls, in the young people that I get to work with in Africa, and hearing their HIV stories puts mine in a global context, which both hurts and heals me. And then thirdly, I think just when my father died of cancer in his remaining years, he reached out to me as another man, and in a father and son relationship, we kind of understood something about the nature of illness and the nature of the decline of the body and the ascension of the soul. And I don't think I would have had that gift of healing that bridge with my father if it wasn't for being positive.
Dion?
I wish I had a clever answer to this question, but I've never really thought about it, to be honest. And I think that we're so fundamentally defined by HIV. I think there's some really famous campaign slogans that are along the lines of "everyone has HIV," and I think it is probably the defining event in sort of 20th century sexuality, and it's kind of hard to imagine a world without it. I think it's had profound. Obviously, I wouldn't, be a scholar in AIDS cultural criticism. Yeah.
I was actually going to say, I mean, look, in some ways it was a very tough and unfair question, but I did it deliberately so we don't fall into the usual AIDS conference rituals. And I was going to say, we all know each other in various ways on this platform, and we wouldn't, I think.
Yeah.
But I actually wanted to give Sean a chance. I mean, it's very tough to be the first person to answer a question like that. And in a sense, it's a simpler question that goes back to this same mix of the personal, the cultural, the social, and really ask each of you to think about how our experience of the epidemic, which for Sean and me goes back to the 80s, and Sean and I actually overlapped, though we didn't know each other then, how your experience of the epidemic has changed larger perceptions in all sorts of ways. And I'll just leave it to you guys to figure out how you want to answer and talk about that.
You didn't know me, but I knew of Dennis as a youngster. I mean, I think I meant what I said. I wasn't just sort of saying something that sounds nice about the world being a gentler place. And so, we wiped out a generation of artists and writers and creative people who contribute so much to creating a healthy society. And it just, the epidemic has spawned all sorts of art and cultural production as well, but not enough to replace what we lost. I think the gay rights movement would have evolved in a very, very different way and would have been much more encompassed as part of a broader feminist movement. I think the epidemic sort of spun something off separate and brought, millions of, ultimately, of gay men and lesbians and others out of the closet who probably would not have otherwise. And there's also a part of me that wants to say if there hadn't been an epidemic, the trends of globalization and consumerism and capitalism would have had to invent one.
Can I just add a question to that? Do you think if there hadn't been an epidemic that queer people would be fighting so hard for marriage rights?
Well, I'm fairly confident that the marriage equality that has been achieved in places probably would not have been had it not been for the epidemic. And I'd like to think that had there not been the epidemic, that we would have sort of continued in a broader way, sort of exploration of new ways of creating relationships and families. I think the epidemic did force us into a, sort of copying or whatever. It created a whole streak in the community towards a conformity and assimilation. And I'm not answering your question very well, but it's an interesting question. It's fine.
It's interesting. I always get really envious of gay men and their relations to HIV because I think that, women are just lumped into one giant category, women, assuming that based on our gender, that we're going to have many things in common. But we don't have the same political togetherness that gay men have had. And I always, whenever I'm...
We have?
What?
I'm so startled by you saying that. What kind of political togetherness do we have?
No, well, gay men have, in relation to HIV, there's things like serosorting. You can choose extended families based on HIV status, lovers. I may be going off topic.
But this is a first world perspective, isn't it? I mean, men who are, quote, gay in most parts of the world neither have that identity nor that possibility of community.
You are very right, and this is very true. But I think, and I guess from a Western point of view, Western gay men I'm envious of. Let's clarify, because although you were saying that there was this conforming of a gay men's community in many ways, there must have been a sense of togetherness and rising to the occasion that I've always really admired, where women, especially in the North, hasn't really had that.
I've kind of lost what the original question was actually about the impact.
Well,
something about the cultural impact.
Can we take you then to that, Paul? Because you are actually, both you and Jessica are actually performers, right? Mm-hmm. And I would actually like you to think about how you relate your work as performers to your position as being advocates, and also, Paul, in your case, being an academic. So, you are triaging, I think, three sorts of work. Yeah. And this is really what I think we're interested in tonight, is how they come together.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I was just thinking about this today, that since I've come here to Melbourne, there's been this blurring, of the boundaries of my life as an academic and as a performance maker and as a human being as well. So I'm making work that is intensely autobiographical. I've got a solo show that I've done in London and here called Fathers and Feathers. It's about my relationship with HIV and my late father. But it's I also work for the Positive Speakers Bureau of Living Positive Victoria. So I go out and I speak to communities of people to inform them first about sexual health education. So that's the facts and figures bit. But then I tell my personal narrative as a positive person, and so there's suddenly a person in the room rather than lots of facts and scary figures and stuff. And this I've just noticed that there's this weird collapsing of my performance self, my academic self, and myself. And it's all sort of blurring into one. So I suppose what I'm sort of saying is that I'm constantly performing my body, if that makes sense. I know that when I'm going out to do talks at the schools, as I have done this tonight, I'm not saying this is like a school, but I wear tight T-shirts because I go down to the gym, and I somehow think that it's important for school children to see my biceps before they see me. Because it doesn't quite. I know it sounds really vain, doesn't it? But it's just to sort of twist around the perceptions that they might have of what a HIV positive person looks like. So I'm aware of that. But then when I'm telling my personal narrative to sometimes 270 Year 10 students, imagine that, if you will. I mean, that's hard enough to be thrown into the lion's den of being placed in that. But then having to tell them something really personal, really intimate about my life, that I am HIV positive and how I got it. All those things. And of course, my sexuality as a gay man. It's like this, life is just like this constant stream of outing at the moment. So I think living as a positive gay academic Briton in Melbourne is just about my life opening up, and I have so few boundaries now that it's actually really liberating as an artist. It's liberating.
Okay, that's Jessica. I think you should pick up on this.
Yeah. No, I feel quite similar to you. I often feel like I'm a bit of a HIV show pony. I am, and a lot of my work is. And I perform a hyper-sexualized woman living with HIV. A lot of times, women living with HIV or the conversation around HIV and women is mostly around reproductive health. And sure, that's not so much my interest, but it's never around sexual health or rights of women, and you never see women living with HIV as being sexy. They always have a baby attached to them, and it's more about emphasis on the child and less on the mother. And queer women are definitely underrepresented in the discussion. So a lot of my work, whether it be one of my pieces is a No Pants, No Problem, which fronts as an underwear dance party, and which I curate a politicized space to talk about that. So prancing around in my underwear, being, once again, like a show pony, yeah, you can fuck me, and whether that's what I'm into or not at the moment, that persona gets people talking and creates a dialogue about seeing women as sexual beings. I'm actually, that body of work is challenged quite a bit, and I do get a lot of pushback from other women living with HIV because they're like, no, you can't act like that, you can't be like that, because then people will think we deserve it.
Actually, I want to pick up from there, and it picks up partly too from Dion's question about marriage. And I'm going to throw it to Sean, and then actually I'm going to ask Dion to comment from an Australian perspective. When I asked you all about the impact of the epidemic, I expected answers that would be about how it has opened up space to talk about sex. It's certainly opened up research money to talk about sex, but at the same time, and I think Jessica and I would be in total agreement, research money that has to fit certain assumptions, right? So, and I mean, I've often said, many of you in this audience will know that gay men in Australia are probably the most over-surveyed population in the world. And personally, I would stop it, but that's another point. But I'm actually going to ask Sean to reflect on this. And as I said, it'd be interesting to get Dion's comments as a younger person in Australia, how far Sean's American experience may be replicated or may be different here.
I mean, it certainly has spawned a conversation about sex, but I think it's probably a very different conversation than might have happened otherwise. In the late 70s and the early 80s, the gay rights movement was sort of in a struggle for whether it was going to be a sexual liberation movement, sort of coming out of the 60s, that had something for everybody, to liberate people sexually, whether they were gay or straight or whatever. We wanted to liberate ourselves, we wanted to liberate our parents, we wanted to liberate our neighbors, versus becoming a legal reform movement, chasing what I think of as an illusion of equality. And the epidemic really forced us much more towards that political reform, legal reform movement, and forced our focus to legislators and to electoral politics. And so now we look back and we take great pride in all this equality that has not changed the systems of oppression that have kept the disenfranchised, continue to be disenfranchised. And so I think that related to that is the sexual conversation that whether it's a conversation that changes on the culture, would have been very different had we not gotten diverted in that way.
I will throw it to Dion, then I'd get the rest of you to comment.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if this is an Australian perspective or really just a kind of general observation, but AIDS is this, HIV/AIDS is this thing that has kind of exposed a lot of kind of truths about sexuality that weren't discussed or that were taboo or that were kind of too complicated to fit into the conventional paradigms or conventional identities around sexuality. So, the sort of messiness of sexuality and of people's sexual practices, a really classic example obviously is, the people who don't fit into our categories of straight male or gay male. And I guess, this is a sort of sexually transmitted disease. So it's forced us to think about sexual practices, people's actual sexual practices that aren't always, kind of easily contained into kind of coupledom and so forth. So, in some ways, that's the sort of scandal of HIV. It does, and that's the reason why I think a lot of the time we want to turn away from it, because it's kind of quite confronting to actually realise the complexity of sexuality.
I guess for me, I think I was a really good liar before I had HIV. I think I learned to lie, properly when I was in the closet. I learned to tell a lot of lies when I was in the closet. And when for me, it comes down to that moment, of disclosure when it's just about one person telling someone else something really personal about themselves, and they meet another human being in fear and anxiety, and then they just tell them something about themselves. It's, it's kind of that simple, just to be honest. And then in the heat of that moment, and in the seduction of that moment, another person accepts that news. And in my experience, something is given, once the disclosure has happened. It opens up a space where someone can say something really honest about themselves. And
Paul, I'm going to stop you there because I want
it.
to take you back to something you've said. No, because I want to take it away from the question of coming out as HIV, back to the question that everybody else has raised about sexuality, and to reflect on how the general perceptions of sexuality may have changed and in what direction they've changed because of HIV. And then I want to go on to the way this is represented culturally It's all right, you can think about that.
But in other ways, it hasn't changed at all. I mean, it's changed, but it is. I want to tell a quick story that I think the.
Thinking
so
it's good.
The Ricky Wilkins, who's a trans person in the U.S., tells a great story about being invited to college campuses to speak, and inevitably, some eager, bright-eyed young gay boy picks Ricky up at the airport and takes Ricky to the. Do you know the story I'm going to tell? To the hall.
Sean, I was nodding because you and I have many times been picked up by bright young gay boys
exactly.
at airports, and it has rarely led to the satisfaction we would hope.
Right. So, and Ricky tells a story about showing up at some campus auditorium, and it's the campus queer club and this and that, and whatever, and Ricky gets introduced as so happy to welcome Ricky Wilkins here. And Ricky's here, and Ricky is going to talk about her gender issues with us. And Ricky was the founder of Transsexual Menace and all sorts of things. And Ricky gets up and says, "No, I'm not going to talk about my gender issues. I want to talk about your gender issues." And these, cool gay boys, "What do you mean our gender issues? We're cool. We're inviting the trans person here. This is, And she says, "Okay, let's do an experiment." She says, "How many of you identify as gay or homosexual or whatever? Raise your hands." Almost every hand in the room went up. And then she says, "And how many of you identify as bottoms?" Every hand in the room goes down, and then the room bursts into laughter because it still is, fundamentally an issue around masculinity and femininity and what defines that and penetration of male bodies. That's changed a little bit, but it still is the iceberg out there.
And that's absolutely something that HIV has reinforced because of its modes of transmissions and because of the way that it was publicised and so scandalously. And because the way that disease itself is kind of already culturally feminized in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Can we pick that? There's an article today in The Conversation, I think by somebody who you actually may be supervising, I'm not sure.
No.
Sorry, Dion.
No.
We all have to be multiply outed on this platform.
He's here actually, Josh.
Okay.
Do you want to wave?
Hey,
yeah.
well, I'm going to... The point you were making is the one I want to ask the panel about, which is that the current representations in mass media, in mainstream film and television, and remember we in Australia see basically the stuff that comes from North America as well as local stuff, is still fixed in an older part of the epidemic. But there is very little currently that in mainstream media. There is, of course, and I really want to encourage people here to look at what is on around this conference. There are very many art exhibitions, dramatic and dance performances. But let's think about mainstream media. And the argument I think you made was basically the mainstream media, and particularly films and television depictions of the epidemic, are largely historical. They are not depictions of the current epidemic. And it actually comes back to the point you began with, Sean, when you said, today there is greater stigma. That is certainly not what mainstream media is telling us, right?
Right. No, not at all. but it's also, we're in this historical, sort of look-back moment in their films, their books, and, I introduced myself, neglected to mention my book. My publisher would slit my throat. But I had an experience a while back. I got an email from someone who asked if I had known his mother. She died of AIDS in the mid-1980s, and I did happen to know her. She was part of the People with AIDS Coalition in New York. And he was 2 years old when she died, but he could find no reference to her, nothing online. He only found a reference. I wrote something and just mentioned her name one time. And so then I sent out an email. I was curious to the fiercest, women AIDS activists I knew, and asked, who was the first woman who went public with an HIV diagnosis? And they were 4 or 5 or 6 years later the names they came up with, because gay men had a culture and a community, so we could carry forth the names of Michael Cowan and Dan Turner and Bobby Campbell and our early heroes. The first woman, invisible. The early role of African Americans in the epidemic is largely invisible, and it's actually quite profound when one looks at it. So we see how our history is so shaped by, first of all, those who are telling it, but also by the community and the culture that exists around it, and how the epidemic fit into that. Gay men could talk about it in a different way than others could.
Do any of you want to add to this? And thinking particularly of what currently is being shown in mass media, and I'm thinking really of film, television.
Normal Heart.
Yeah. But that's, as I said, I wanted an Australian perspective as well. And
well, this is something that I'm really interested in, and this is kind of something that I noticed. As I said, when I started my PhD, there was kind of nothing. There was no HIV representations on television or in the cinema, barely at all. And every time I met someone and told them about my research, they would say, "Oh, have you seen Philadelphia?" And yes, I've seen that. And now, of course, people will say, "Oh, have you seen Dallas Buyers Club?" Because this is the kind of new Hollywood AIDS blockbuster that everyone has seen. And it is an example of a trend which, as Josh pointed out in his article today, of retrospective imaginings of AIDS crisis. And there's not only these more popular films, but a kind of whole stream of documentaries that have been made revisiting those years. And I think that these are complex. This is a kind of complex phenomenon. And on the one hand, it does, as Josh argued today, kind of represent HIV more broadly to people who aren't personally affected or professionally involved with it as something that did happen in the past, as a kind of posterior moment. But also, it's a kind of, representations of history are always telling us something about the present day. So I'm not quite sure what that is, but...
Well, can we go to the present day? And Paul, I think you've had probably the most connection of any of us on this platform with some of the performances that are going on in Melbourne at the moment. And you might actually want to share some of that and, in fact, direct people here to some of what is happening currently around HIV.
Yeah, sure. I suppose I just want to say quickly in answer to that, that the VCA recently put on productions, the level 3 students were putting on productions around HIV. And it was really interesting because in both circumstances, there were 2 productions. They wanted to go back to those days. That was the first impulse. And we were all kind of a bit horrified about that. And it was like, leave it, and just say how it is now. What is the contemporary perspective? And there does seem to be a reticence to talk about the now. However, having said that, productions that are on at the moment, I'm personally involved with the Glory Project, which some of you might have seen it. It's in City Square, alongside the Positively Fabulous caravan, Pink Caravan. And it's basically a glory hole structure, and it's sort of subtitled "Glory Hole: How Safe Is Your Hole?" And it's yeah, I know. And it's inviting sort of like people to use the whole as a playful point of transmission of artifacts. You know, sometimes you can put your ear to a hole and you will receive a poem, or you'll receive a perfect piece of information, or a secret, for example. And it's, you know, a load of like performative playing, you know, around the glory hole. So there's sex there. But it's in a public space, and that sort of feels quite naughty and quite subversive and quite delicious. There are verbatim pieces out there, verbatim, so it's taking other people's stories and making that into theatrical form. The Death of Kings looks back to the early days of the AIDS crisis in Sydney. Status takes contemporary reporting of life stories, and that plays that to contemporary stories of people in Melbourne, in fact, who have experienced HIV stigma and discrimination, and that's made it again into a verbatim play. There is beautifully Philip Adams' Ballet Lab, HIV, We All Live With It, and that interestingly, you know, diverts from the verbatim sort of like form, because it's real people telling their stories, not having other people tell their stories, and I think that's kind of like the way forward, you know, personally, is to have that advocacy of the person with the story.
Okay, I'm going to stop you at that, because my last question, I'm sorry, the reason I keep hurrying you guys is that I'm very conscious that in 2 minutes people are going to come down the aisle with mics so that people in the audience can ask questions. And I'm going to pick up Paul's last point and ask you all, I'm being deliberately, as you know I would be, provocative. I'm going to ask you to think about the limits to people telling their stories, and whether there are problems with the idea that there is something more authentic if it is the voices of people living with HIV. And I don't know who wants to get into this minefield first, but I think it's a question that is worth grappling with. Jessica, you were nodding. So.
Oh, yeah, no, think nodding. So I think that it's kind of hard. It's like you can't win and you can't lose, you know? It's like double-edged sword. So I think I think people living with HIV should be given the space to tell their own stories, to take up that space for authenticity is a bit complicated, and I think that but there's I guess I think that with that becomes so much there's a lot of pressure for you to represent beyond yourself. I think there's a lot of pressure to tell things that other people don't have to tell. You know, I think there's people like to inquire about how, when, what your sex life is like, all these personal questions that other people don't have to share. And sometimes, you know, you don't really want to talk about that, but you're always on display. And I think when you merge your personal and private lives, there's almost never the opportunity to just have your own personal space and to shut it down. And I think that we're both, as if there's only two of us. It's interesting because as people living with HIV, I think we fight to tell our own stories from our own mouths, but there's a significant burden that comes with that, and a responsibility that is unlike no other.
Sean, do you want to come in on this?
You know, when people telling their stories, no one wants to hear about your happy childhood. You know, when we're telling our stories, we're telling about our traumas and how they affect us, shaped us, remember from them. And for, you know, a lot of, you know, my demographic milieu, AIDS was a singular sort of challenge. You know, it was the first time the system had really not served us. Okay, we were gay, maybe suffered some kind of discrimination, but basically the color of our skin and our gender gave us adequate privilege that really was I don't want to say inconsequential, but it was very minor considered compared to what AIDS did to us. But for an awful lot of other people, AIDS had to kind of get in line. There was a hierarchy of oppressions that it may or may not be, the one, dominant thing. And were communities that were already quite accustomed to being neglected, to being forgotten, to being, I ACT UP, which was a very important part of my life, but I like to make the point that, first of all, the activism that preceded that was more radical than ACT UP. And ACT UP was really when the gay white male energy around the epidemic and anger and fear had reached kind of a critical mass and mobilized. And the very first demonstration that ACT UP undertook was at the New York Stock Exchange. And I think that is very telling. That was where gay white men went when they were angry and indignant, and rightfully so. So, the telling of the stories is, first of all, healing, particularly for people who feel like they haven't been heard, regardless of AIDS or whatever. There's also, I think, for some of us, there's a compulsion. There are fewer and fewer people around who, were kind of there and on the front lines from the beginning. And when you look at the cultural production following the Holocaust, there wasn't really all that much in the 1940s, the 1950s. It wasn't until the early 60s, when enough time and distance had passed to have some perspective, as well as that sort of growing sense of pressure that if I don't tell this story, who is going to carry that forward? And we are at risk of losing, how little people know about the early years of the epidemic and the retro-heterosexualization of those years. Dallas Buyers Club is an example. There are many others. So the storytelling, sometimes it can be tedious. I even get tired of my own stories. But there's also a real kind of urgent imperative for many of us. And, you hear so often, gay men of my generation talking about prevention. They talk about young gay men and they want to knock them upside the head. Don't they know what we went through? And they just want to shake them and they're out there. And that, they don't want to hear about grandpa's service in the war. And the consequences of HIV infection today are fundamentally different in the developed world for people who have access to healthcare than they were years ago. And you have to start with, when I do prevention discussions in campuses, I start with saying, if you get HIV, you're not going to die of it. And that's like a shock, and that gets the attention and opens the conversation.
I want to thank you all. It's been a fabulous evening, and we will all stay around and sign books, T-shirts, and give out mobile phone numbers if necessary. So thank you.
Oh, we have a thing to do.